guys. We're here at the Mountain Meadows Massacre site, and I'm going to talk briefly about what happened here. You're going to learn plenty of some of the background and happenings of this event from other material, but I do want to talk a little bit about it while I'm here. The event itself, there was a group of immigrants. They were traveling from Arkansas and Missouri to California. Kind of a mixed party. Most of them were from Arkansas. So they're headed to California and they're going through Utah, as most travelers did at the time. Utah was the waypoint. Everyone traveled through it. And on their journey through Utah, once they came to, this is kind of the southwestern corner of Utah, a place called Mountain Meadows next to Cedar City. They were camped here on Mountain Meadows, and they were ambushed, attacked by a group of settlers and natives, but I'll get to that in a minute, that were here. They attacked and in the process killed basically every man, woman, and child that was old enough to pass word to anyone. So there were a few surviving children that were very young, but most of them were killed, about 120 people. This event is considered by many historians, Utah historians, to be the darkest day in Utah history, the most momentous occurrence, the point at which something happened that is formatively hard to explain. And in an attempt to explain it, we have to understand a few things about who was involved and the reasons they were giving. I guess I do want to show this before I start talking about the info here. So this is a memorial, they call it a cairn or rock pile. It's patterned after the original one that was built, that was damaged and weathered, and they rebuilt to revamp this whole memorial site. I'm actually, before I explain too, I'm also going to read this. There's a very interesting description here. It's well written. I'm going to just read it right out. So this is what happened here. Members of the Arkansas Wagon Train set up camp at this site on Saturday, September 5th, 1857. On Sunday, they likely rested and gathered for a Christian worship service, a pattern they had followed throughout their journey. The next morning, they were attacked without warning. They pulled their wagons into a circle slightly larger than the fenced area where we are now, so I'm going to show you kind of how big that fenced area is. So not very big. They chained the wagon wheels together, dug below each wheel to lower the wagon beds to the ground, and this provided a shield against gunfire. They also dug a long defensive trench that served as a rifle pit. About 140 men, women, and children tried to take cover in the wagon circle, with many huddling together in the trench. At least 7 immigrants were killed in the first wave of attack. The immigrants repulsed the attackers, killing 1 and wounding 2. 3 or more immigrants died here during the 5-day siege that followed. Each time, firing resumed on the camp. The women and children could be heard screaming with fear, and with each attack, the immigrants put up a brave and determined defense. Not all the defenders were men. Survivor Mulim Tackett told of his aunt Eloa Angeline Tackett Jones, valiantly joining the fight, grabbing a gun that had belonged to one of the fallen men. Throughout the siege, the emigrants were cut off from their water supply. Courageous men ran the wagon circle to get water at the nearby spring. Despite heavy gunfire, some managed to fill their buckets and return to the circle. 2 men, once left to gather wood, finished their task under gunfire and returned unharmed. Others bravely led the wagon circle. Stories about these men differ. Some accounts say that 3 or 4 young men left the safety of the camp and went northeast. They were most likely going to Cedar to ask for help. Only one of the young men made it back to the campsite alive. Another account tells of 3 young men, one of them with the last name Baker, escaping during the siege. They headed southwest, carrying a document that described the emigrants and what they had endured. All 3 were tracked down and murdered in the desert. The document they carried has disappeared. In the 5th day of the siege, the attackers came to the camp. Under a white flag, they deceived the emigrants with a false promise of safe passage to Cedar City. The emigrants were almost out of ammunition. They needed water. The wounded required attention. Realizing that they could not endure much more, they surrendered, grieving, and walked away from the campsite. The men were the last to leave, relying on their captors' promise to protect them and their families. And the rest is history. They were essentially gunned down at that point. So, how does this happen? The context we really need to lay here is the psychology of a massacre, how massacres happen, why they happen. There are a lot of historians who study massacres exclusively to explain and seek to understand just why they occurred. In the studies that have been done, a lot of patterns have been noticed. One particular pattern suggests that groups of people who at one time were targets of massive injustices or even like physical abuse, coupled with intense fears, is like the magic potion behind what can create within a person the willingness to do something like this. Psychologically, that's kind of the seedbed in which this sort of event becomes possible. So we need to understand in the context of Utah Mormons, because this was largely carried out by members of the church here in the southern region of the state. So we have to understand that psychologically, leading up to 1857, they have definitely fit that particular bill. Not only was their religious leader, Joseph Smith, massacred in Illinois before they had to move west, but also following that event, the siege of Nauvoo was almost salt to the wound. It became this experience where not only was their leader killed, but people who dressed as state forces, state militia, laid siege to Nauvoo in an attempt to push them completely out. Obviously, we know that they were pushed out. They left. It was a huge, difficult ordeal for everyone who was involved in it. There's plenty written by leadership at the time to suggest that members who sought retribution were told not to seek it at the time. Another piece of that recipe for disaster, I suppose, in the long run, because those internal conflicts, those anxieties and fears and angers involved with the injustices they felt they were dished back east were just carried with them when they came here. Not only that, but when particularly the southern Mormons, or the Mormons from the southern Utah area arrived in southern Utah, they realized that they went from hardships back east to hardships in a desert climate. They faced particular hardships that even Mormons in northern Utah just didn't face. So their lives were tough. They had very little. They had been forced out of their homes and attacked and abused. And on top of all of that, we have to also understand there's a lot of fear in Utah in 1857. Because 1857 is that point at which the Utah War is really kicking off. People in the U.S. government think that Utah Mormons and Utah Native Americans are joining forces in opposition to the American system, that they're raising an army, they're going to come attack American settlements and all of these things. So in a response of fear from the U.S. government, they send troops during the Utah War to come essentially quell the rebellion that they were sure was happening here. So suddenly wagon trains carrying mail are discontinued because of safety, and people in Utah are realizing just how real the possibility is that they'll be at war with the United States. Granted, keep in mind, Utah is not a state at this point in history. It's a territory. So the fears that they're feeling are fears of outsiders thinking that the Americans are going to come wipe them out. On top of those fears, they have that pent-up aggression from the abuse they experienced that comes to a head particularly with this group in Mountain Meadows, because there were rumors spreading that these particular people may or may not have been involved in the massacre of, the martyrdom of Joseph Smith in Illinois. So there are stories from these people and that people and whomever about how they overhear there are people in this immigrant group who claim to have been part of the mob that killed Joseph Smith. They claim to have the same muskets. They claim to be coming to start the job that the U.S. government's going to finish, which is to eradicate all Mormons. There's just rumors spreading wild about these immigrants, particularly, again, in southern Utah, where the wagon train is headed. It's taking a route kind of from the northern Utah area down and then out west from there toward California. So what ends up happening is local church leadership in southern Utah get together and decide, what are we going to do about this threat? The council that meets, again, these are members of church leadership, and that's part of the reason why this is a very sensitive event for a lot of people to come to terms with. But understand that the initial decision made by this council of leadership in southern Utah was to do nothing to the immigrant group. And they knew that that's what they would be counseled to do from Salt Lake City. Later on, that is what they were counseled to do from Salt Lake City, but unfortunately, the letter sent by Young to tell them not to do anything was written September 10th, and this event happened September 11th. So back in that time, a letter would take far more than a single day to make it all the way down to Cedar area. But unfortunately, there were a few members of that council that decided they knew better than the rest. And there are names that we'll go over later, individuals like Haight and Johnson and Lee, who essentially got together outside of the council meeting and decided, you know what, we need to take action regardless of what the council has deemed should be done, because if we don't, no one will, and it has to be done. And this is what they decided to do. They decided to essentially make the immigrant group pay for all of that hardship and heartache. In the end, September 11th rolls around, and all of those tensions come to a head. The saddest thing here, of course, is the brutality of the violence experienced. Those who planned the massacre decided as a group that they should, quote, make it an Indian massacre. They wanted to make sure that the natives were blamed for it. So in making that plan, they decided there was no better way to blame the natives than to make it look like a native attack. It was widely believed that natives were ruthless in their attacks and would kill indiscriminately, which is really the reason why they killed men, women, and children in this attack, or at least one of the reasons, so that they could point the finger at the Paiutes who they had invited along for the ride, and say it was their doing, and blame them for all that happened. And that's the narrative that stuck for a while. The Paiutes were tagged with ownership of this event for a very long time. Obviously, there were lots of questions about who ordered the attack, why they ordered it, how much of it was led by church authorities, or if they were involved at all, and all of that stuff. The historical accounts seem to suggest that it's quite clear direction from Salt Lake City was that this should never have happened. In fact, the letter given to the boy to send down here to say, do not attack this group, let them move forward in peace. The boy's instruction was to come with all haste, sparing no horses. So he was essentially told to get down here as soon as possible to stop whatever could possibly happen. But again, the letter was not written or sent in time for anything to be stopped. And it's important that we acknowledge the reality of events like this and understand that there are complicated reasons that things like this happen, and the complication of the reason does not in any way justify the action at all, but it does help us to at least put a reason to it, and realize that there's a cost to acting out of fear and judgment and rumors. It's a nice memorial these days, now that it's been rebuilt and rededicated and all of that. They have little markers in here to let you know just who is buried and where, as well as we have names and ages of victims listed here along the whole border of the site. So again, we will see some of the documents associated with this event in the week's work, but understand that this is an important episode in Utah history and one to certainly never forget.